The Battle of the Kalka River, 1223. The first clash between the Mongols and the Russian princes in the early 13th century, winds of change swept across the heart of Asia, carrying with them the thunderous hooves of Mongol horses that began reshaping the known world. After uniting the steppe tribes under his banner, Genghis Khan unleashed his vast armies toward the east and west, ushering in a new era of conquest unparalleled in history. Meanwhile, the Russian and Cuman, or Kipchak, lands were mired in fragmentation and internal strife, oblivious to the storm brewing in the east. The Battle of the Kalka River, fought in the spring of 1223, marked the first bloody encounter between Mongol forces and the Rus Cuman Alliance, a confrontation that revealed the overwhelming might of Mongol discipline and the vulnerability of Eastern European kingdoms against the merciless tactics of the steppe. Historical background. The Mongols' move west. The campaign of Jebe and Subutai westward was not merely a passing raid but part of a grander strategy devised by Genghis Khan to explore new territories and expand his influence. He sent the two Mongol commanders at the head of a formidable, though not overwhelming, force, one intended more for reconnaissance and punitive action than full-scale invasion. Their stated mission was to pursue Shah Muhammad II of Khwarezm, who had fled the Mongols after the collapse of his empire, but their unspoken goal was to test the strength of the kingdoms and tribes to the west. Along their path, the Mongols clashed with the Cumans, Turkic nomadic tribes inhabiting the steppes north of the Caspian and Black Seas. Having heard of Mongol atrocities in Central Asia, the Cumans sought aid from the Russian princes. The Russians, largely unaware of the Mongol threat, saw an opportunity to extend their influence into the steppes and answered the call. Thus, a fragile alliance was formed, uniting the principalities of Kievan Rus, including Chernihiv, Galicia, and others, with the Cumans. Yet this coalition lacked unified leadership and true coordination. The march to the Kalka River, the beginning of the end. The Russian and Cuman forces moved south to confront the Mongol threat, with each prince leading his troops independently, without a clear strategy. In contrast, Jebe and Subutai were fully aware of their enemy's weaknesses and relied on classic Mongol tactics: deception, maneuver, and swift, deadly strikes. When the two armies met near the Kalka River, in present-day Ukraine, the Mongols set their plan into motion. In the initial days, the skirmishes appeared minor, as the Mongols probed the enemy's strength. Then, suddenly, they feigned retreat, a classic steppe warfare tactic designed to lure the enemy into open terrain. The Russians fell for the ruse, charging recklessly after the seemingly fleeing Mongols, unaware they were advancing into a deadly trap. Once the Russian forces had moved far enough from secure positions, the Mongols wheeled around like a storm, encircling them from all sides. The great slaughter, the collapse of the alliance. The battle quickly turned into a massacre. The Russian troops, though brave, were hindered by their heavy armor and slow movement, while the Mongols darted like lightning, unleashing arrows from all directions before vanishing like shadows. Thousands of Russian and Cuman soldiers fell under the Mongol onslaught, while the survivors fled in panic. But the Mongols, masters of the steppe hunt, pursued them without mercy. The river itself became a scene of horror as hundreds drowned in their desperate attempts to cross. The fate of the Russian princes was even more tragic. Some, like Mstislav III of Kiev, were besieged in a fortified camp but surrendered after days of dwindling supplies. The Mongols had promised them safe passage, but in keeping with their custom toward those who resisted, they broke their oath. Mstislav and other nobles were executed in a brutal manner, crushed beneath wooden platforms as the Mongols feasted above them in a grotesque celebration. Aftermath. The shock to Eastern Europe. The defeat at the Kalka River was not just a military loss but a psychological and political shock to the Russian princes. The battle exposed how division and arrogance could lead to catastrophe and how outdated tactics were useless against an organized force like the Mongols. Although the Mongols did not press further into Europe at the time, withdrawing eastward after the battle, they sent a clear message: the steppes no longer belonged to the Cumans or the Russians. They were now part of the Mongol world. Just 2 decades later, the Mongols returned under Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, to finish what Jebe and Subutai had begun. In 1237, they ravaged Russia and Eastern Europe in devastating campaigns, establishing the Golden Horde, which ruled the region for centuries. Thus, the Battle of the Kalka River was merely the opening chapter in a new, bloody era of Eastern European history, one written by Mongol swords and governed by the unforgiving laws of the steppe. The Battle of Kalka River, the bloody encounter that changed Eurasia's destiny in the early dawn of the 13th century. While Western Europe was embroiled in its feudal conflicts and the Mediterranean world was witnessing the final days of the Crusades, a violent storm was gathering in the depths of Central Asia. These fierce winds of change carried with them the thunderous hooves of Mongol horses that would overturn the balance of power in the ancient world. The Battle of Kalka River in May 1223 became the defining moment when Eastern Europe discovered a new rising power from the east, a force they had never known before and were utterly unprepared to face. Across the vast Eurasian steppes, where civilizations met and nations clashed, the Mongols under Genghis Khan were weaving the fabric of an empire unprecedented in history. The campaign of Jebe and Subutai was not merely a passing raid, but the culmination of a carefully crafted strategy years in the making. Genghis Khan had sent these two veteran commanders on a punitive reconnaissance mission that combined military and political objectives, gathering intelligence while punishing enemies. The Mongol forces crossed the Caucasus Mountains with astonishing tactical brilliance, suddenly emerging in the northern steppes where the Turkic Kipchak tribes lived their traditional nomadic existence. The first encounter between these new nomads and the old turned brutally violent. The Kipchaks, known to Europeans as Cumans, found themselves suddenly facing an enemy superior in numbers, organization, and combat capability. The unequal confrontation quickly turned into a bloody chase across the steppes. In their panic, the Kipchak leaders turned to their traditional allies, the Rus princes of Kiev. Their desperate messages carried tones of fear. There has come upon us a people never seen before, who eat their horses' flesh, move like the wind, wear strange leather garments, and fight with indescribable cruelty. The Rus princes didn't fully comprehend the nature of this new threat, yet they decided to act. Forces gathered from various Rus principalities, from mighty Kiev, then the jewel of Rus cities, from Galicia, Chernihiv, Smolensk, and others. Each prince brought his armored knights, peasant soldiers, and noble retinues. The spectacle was impressive by any measure. The Rus forces of that era relied on heavy cavalry resembling Western European medieval knights, but this massive army suffered from deep structural problems. Each principality marched with its independent forces, each prince sought glory for himself, with no unified command or clear strategy. Worse still, relations between the Rus and their Kipchak allies were strained. Their history of conflict predated their alliance. As the Allied forces moved south, Jebe and Subutai studied the situation carefully. The Mongols never fought battles without calculating the odds. The two Mongol commanders relied on their spy network among the tribes and their extensive experience in reading enemy movements. They decided to implement classic Mongol strategy: lure, feign retreat, then ambush. When the armies finally met on the banks of the Kalka River, events unfolded with dramatic speed. The first day saw only minor skirmishes, probing actions from both sides. But the Mongols were testing enemy defenses, studying strengths and weaknesses. Then came the decisive moment when the Mongols began their feigned retreat, appearing to flee the battlefield. Here the Rus princes fell into the trap. Without coordination, some charged after the seemingly retreating Mongols while others hesitated. The Kipchak forces were first to pursue, followed by Galician knights under Mstislav Mstislavich. The pursuit proved foolish. These forces moved away from the main army and their natural defensive positions. When the Mongols judged the enemy had advanced sufficiently, they suddenly reversed course. The feigned retreat transformed into a devastating counterattack. Surrounding Mongol forces began raining deadly arrows from all directions. The scene resembled wolves encircling prey. The heavily armored Rus forces found themselves unable to maneuver, while Kipchak formations disintegrated as they tried unsuccessfully to flee. Within hours, the battlefield became a scene of horrific slaughter. Thousands fell under the relentless Mongol arrow storm. The river itself filled with bodies of those who drowned attempting escape. Some Rus princes tried organizing a last defense, fortifying a temporary camp, but the Mongols besieged them mercilessly. After days of brutal siege, the surviving Rus princes surrendered. But surrender couldn't save them from their grim fate. Following Mongol tradition with resisting enemies, they were executed horrifically. The Mongols placed wooden planks over the captive princes' bodies, then sat atop them in celebratory feasting while the victims slowly suffocated beneath the weight. The battle's political and military consequences proved profound. For the Mongols, it successfully tested their combat capabilities against new enemy types. For the Rus world, it represented an existential shock. The battle revealed the depth of divisions between Rus principalities and the existing military-political system's inability to face new challenges. Historically ironic, the Mongols didn't immediately exploit their victory. After the battle, they withdrew eastward to rejoin Genghis Khan. But they left behind a clear message: a new, merciless, and invincible power had emerged in the steppes. The Battle of Kalka River was merely the prelude to the full Mongol invasion that would descend upon Rus 2 decades later, when the Mongols returned under Bata Khan to establish the Golden Horde that would dominate the region for centuries. In Russian historical memory, the Battle of Kalka River remained a festering wound, a harsh lesson about what happens when national unity fractures and enemies are underestimated. In world history, it marked a pivotal moment of civilizational contact, when Eastern Europe collided with the vast Mongol world, when the destinies of entire peoples intersected on the banks of a small river in the Eurasian steppes. The Battle of Kalka River, the fateful clash that shook the thrones of Eurasia on a scorching May day in 1223, as the sun blazed over the steppes of present-day Ukraine, armies gathered unknowingly on the brink of writing a bloody chapter in history. Along the banks of the tranquil Kalka River, which would forever after bear the name of this great massacre, stood the Mongol forces led by the legendary commanders Jebe and Subutai, facing a massive alliance of Russian princes and Cuman tribes. The winds carried the scent of tension and fear mingled with the aroma of wild steppe grasses. The powerful Mongol horses snorted restlessly, as if sensing the approaching moment of reckoning. Meanwhile, the heavy warhorses of the Russian knights stamped nervously, bearing their ironclad riders from head to toe, warriors who believed themselves the strongest in the known world. From a small hill, the veteran Mongol commander Jebe observed enemy movements with the keen eye of a seasoned fox. He knew this battle must become an unforgettable lesson. Beside him stood Subutai, the unparalleled strategic mind, formulating the final battle plan in his thoughts. The two complemented each other perfectly, like twin swords in the hand of the great Genghis Khan. Across the field, Russian princes gathered in a large tent, each insisting on his own opinion. Mstislav III, the Grand Prince of Kiev, sought to assert his authority over the others. The young Daniel of Galicia burned with eagerness for battle. The experienced Mstislav Mstislavich tried warning them of the situation's gravity. But pride and internal disputes prevented them from agreeing on a unified plan. Their Cuman allies grew increasingly anxious. Having witnessed Mongol military might firsthand, their leader Kotian attempted to convince the Russians of caution, but his words fell on deaf ears. The Russians believed their heavy armor and powerful steeds could crush any foe, even one from the world's farthest reaches. At dawn, the decisive battle commenced. The Mongols unleashed deadly arrow volleys that pierced Russian armor like parchment. The more mobile Cuman forces tried to maneuver but found themselves surrounded on all sides. Jebe led a lightning strike against the enemy's left flank while Subutai masterfully coordinated encircling movements. Amidst the battle's haze, the Russian Cuman Alliance began collapsing. Russian knights, weighed down by their armor, proved helpless against Mongol mobility. Cuman troops fled in panic, exposing the Russian flank. The Mongols, like starving wolves, pounced on the opportunity without mercy. By noon, the river ran crimson. Thousands of corpses floated on the water or piled along the banks. The Russian princes who had argued in their tent hours earlier now lay dead or captured. Mstislav of Kiev found himself trapped on a small hill, organizing desperate but futile resistance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Battle of Kalka River ended in overwhelming Mongol victory. Jebe and Subutai walked the battlefield, surveying their triumph. This day marked only the beginning of a new era, one Eastern Europe would know for centuries as the Mongol yoke. In the following days, the Mongols held their victory feast. Captured Russian princes were placed beneath wooden platforms while the victors feasted above them. Screams of agony mingled with triumphant laughter, the Mongol way of sending an unmistakable message. Resistance was futile. News of the Russian army's catastrophe spread like wildfire. From Kiev to Novgorod, terror gripped Russian cities. They suddenly realized the world had become more dangerous than imagined. A new power had emerged from the east, one that knew no mercy and tolerated no rivals. Yet history's irony revealed itself when the Mongols didn't immediately invade Russia after this battle. They vanished as suddenly as they appeared, returning east to join Genghis Khan's other campaigns. But they left behind a terrifying question: what if they returned with a greater army? The Battle of Kalka River served merely as a warning, a prelude to greater tragedy that would unfold 2 decades later when the Mongols returned under Genghis Khan to conquer all Russia. But on that day in 1223, along the banks of the Kalka River, a new legend of military art was born, and the world came to understand that a new age had dawned. The Battle of Kalka River, the Mongol storm that changed the face of history in the dawn of a momentous spring day in 1223, as morning mist rose over the vast Eurasian steppes. Armies gathered unaware they were about to engage in one of the bloodiest battles of the Middle Ages. Along the banks of the tranquil Kalka River, winding through golden grasslands, stood the Mongol forces led by the legendary commanders Jebe and Subutai, facing a massive alliance of Russian princes and Cuman tribes. The winds carried omens of changes that would overturn the balance of power in the known world. The Mongol commanders embodied the pinnacle of military strategy of their time. Jebe, the courageous leader famous for his battlefield daring, stood tall, observing enemy movements with falcon-like acuity. Beside him stood Subutai, the mastermind whose unprecedented tactics astonished the world. Together they represented the sword and mind of Genghis Khan, sent on an exploratory mission that turned into a decisive battle. In the opposing camp, Russian princes argued in their great command tent. Mstislav III, the Grand Prince of Kiev, sought to impose his will on the other princes. The young Daniel of Galicia burned with eagerness for combat, while the experienced Mstislav Mstislavich warned against underestimating the enemy. But ancient disputes between Russian principalities prevented them from agreeing on a unified plan. Each prince thought of his own interests before those of the alliance. Their Cuman allies, nomadic tribesmen, were more apprehensive. They had witnessed firsthand what Mongol armies could do. Their leader Kotyan tried convincing the Russians to take the Mongol threat seriously, but his words fell on deaf ears. The Russians believed their heavy armor and powerful warhorses could crush any foe, regardless of strength. At sunrise, the decisive battle commenced. The Mongols unleashed deadly arrow volleys that pierced Russian armor like knives through butter. The more mobile Cuman forces attempted maneuvers but found themselves surrounded on all sides. Jebe led a lightning strike against the enemy's left flank while Subutai coordinated encircling movements with unmatched brilliance. Amidst the battle's fog and rising dust, the Russian-Cuman alliance began collapsing. Russian knights, weighed down by heavy armor, proved helpless against Mongol mobility. Cuman troops fled in panic, exposing the Russian flank. The Mongols, waiting for this moment, pounced without mercy like starving wolves attacking prey. By noon, the waters of the Kalka River ran crimson with blood. Thousands of corpses floated on the surface or piled along the banks. The Russian princes who had argued in their tent hours earlier now lay dead or captured. Mstislav of Kiev found himself trapped on a small hill, organizing desperate but futile resistance. As the sun began its westward descent, the Battle of Kalka River ended in overwhelming Mongol victory. Jebe and Subutai walked the battlefield, contemplating the fruits of their triumph. This day marked only the beginning of a new era, one Eastern Europe would know for coming centuries as the Mongol yoke. In the days following the battle, the Mongols held a victory feast that became proverbial for its brutality. Captured Russian princes were placed beneath wooden platforms while the victors feasted above them. Screams of agony mingled with triumphant laughter, the Mongol way of sending an unambiguous message. Resistance was futile. News of the Russian army's catastrophe spread like wildfire. From Kiev to Novgorod, terror gripped Russian cities. They suddenly realized the world had become more dangerous than imagined. A new power had emerged from the east, one that knew no mercy and tolerated no rivals. Yet history's great irony was that the Mongols didn't immediately invade Russia after this battle. They vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, returning east to join Genghis Khan's other campaigns. But they left behind a terrifying question echoing in everyone's minds: what if they returned with a larger army? The Battle of Kalka River served merely as a warning, a prelude to greater tragedy that would unfold 2 decades later when the Mongols returned under Genghis Khan to conquer all Russia. But on that fateful day in 1223, along the banks of the Kalka River, a new legend of military art was born, and the world came to understand that a new age had dawned, an age that would bear the indelible stamp of the Mongols. The Battle of Kalka River, when the Mongols turned retreat into decisive victory in the early morning mist of May 31, 1223, the brilliant Mongol commanders Jebe and Subutai stood atop a high hill overlooking the vast Kalka plain. They studied the movements of the massive Rus Cuman army that outnumbered their forces 3-1. Jebe smiled at Subutai and uttered words that would become legendary in military history: "Let them chase the mirage of defeat until we lead them to their doom." The ingenious plan began with an initial swift Mongol attack. The light Mongol cavalry, with their characteristic agility, struck the Russian vanguard like a storm. The blow was sharp and strong enough to cause panic, but insufficient to be decisive. Then suddenly, as if seized by terror, the Mongols began what appeared to be a disorderly retreat. Some threw down their weapons, others fell from their horses feigning injury. Some Mongols even deliberately dropped their war banners, a traditional sign of defeat in that era. The young Russian Prince Daniel of Galicia, eager to prove his courage, shouted excitedly, "Look! The barbarians are fleeing," and led his knights in enthusiastic pursuit without waiting for unified command. Even the experienced Grand Prince Mstislav of Kiev became convinced the opportunity had come to crush the Mongols. The Russians failed to realize every movement of this retreat was calculated with precise accuracy. The fleeing Mongol forces divided themselves into 3 parallel groups, each retreating at carefully varied speeds. This clever maneuver automatically split the pursuing Russian forces, as each detachment followed a different Mongol group. While the Russians believed they were chasing a defeated enemy, the Mongols were actually herding them like cattle to slaughter. After nearly 20 kilometers of pursuit, the exhausted Russian forces found themselves in an open plain surrounded by hills on 3 sides and the Kalka River on the 4th. Here Jebe gave his famous signal, a red arrow shot into the sky with a distinctive whistle. In one moment, the Mongol retreat transformed into a devastating counterattack. The fleeing forces wheeled about with astonishing discipline. From the surrounding hills emerged fresh Mongol troops that had lain hidden all along. Some Mongols even appeared from underground, where they had dug hidden trenches. The heavily armored Russian knights, exhausted from the long chase under the scorching May sun, found themselves trapped in a deadly snare. The heavy armor that protected them in conventional battles now became a curse, hampering their movement and making them easy targets for deadly Mongol arrows. The lighter Cuman troops attempted to flee, only to collide with additional Mongol units that had tightened the noose around the battlefield. What followed resembled an organized hunt more than a conventional battle. The Mongols, in complete control of the engagement, gradually tightened their encircling ring. As the circle shrank, the hail of arrows intensified. Some Russian knights tried breaking toward the river, only to find more Mongol units armed with crossbows waiting for them. By noon, the battle's outcome was sealed. The ground was littered with bodies of Russian knights and their horses. The river ran red with blood. The few who attempted to surrender found no mercy. The Mongols meant to send a clear message to all of Eastern Europe: resistance against them was not just futile, it would be suicidal. Within a few hours, the Mongol commanders had transformed what appeared to be retreat into one of military history's most brilliant victories. This was not merely clever tactics, it was martial artistry that would later be studied in all military academies as one of history's greatest examples of turning apparent retreat into overwhelming victory. The psychological mastery displayed that day, making the enemy believe they were winning right up to the moment of their destruction, became the hallmark of Mongol military genius. Contemporary chroniclers recorded that when survivors brought word of the disaster back to Kiev, the very mention of the Mongols' name made women weep and strong men tremble. The Kalka River, once an obscure waterway, became synonymous with military catastrophe, while Jebe and Subutai's names entered the annals of history as masters of tactical deception. The Battle of Kalka River, the tragedy that exposed the fragility of Russian principalities on an ominous spring morning in 1223. The forces of Russian princes and their Cuman allies gathered along the peaceful banks of the Kalka River, unaware they were about to fight one of the bloodiest battles in their history. Heavy clouds hung in the sky like portents of impending disaster, While the banners of various Russian principalities fluttered proudly in the wind, each prince dreaming of his share of glory in crushing these barbarians from the east. Inside the grand tent where the allied leaders convened, disputes had erupted from the outset. Grand Prince Mstislav III of Kiev sat on his ornate chair insisting on commanding the army by virtue of his seniority, while young Prince Daniel of Galicia demanded his rights as leader of Galicia's formidable warriors. In the corner, Cuman leader Kotian tried in vain to convince them to take the Mongol threat seriously, but his words fell on deaf ears. The tent buzzed with jealousy and hostility, as each prince nursed decades-old grudges against the others. Outside the tent, the scene was even more chaotic. Russian soldiers from different principalities gathered in separate groups, each displaying their principalities' insignia and speaking in distinct dialects. There was no real coordination between these units. Each prince had brought his own army without any joint operational plan. Even minor commanders quarreled over the best camp positions, sparking brawls among soldiers. The Cuman forces, who should have served as the army's eyes and ears against a mobile enemy, found themselves marginalized. The Cumans knew well what the Mongols were capable of, having faced them before in the eastern steppes. But their constant warnings were met with ridicule from the arrogant Russian knights, who considered themselves undisputed masters of warfare. When Mongol advance guards appeared on the horizon, the scene became both tragic and absurd. The Mongols looked like a disorganized mob of light cavalry, numbering only a few thousand. The fully armored Russian knights, who had spent years training for close combat, viewed them with contempt. Some princes even began arguing about who would have the honor of delivering the decisive blow. What followed was a brutal lesson in the art of war. The Mongols launched a lightning attack, then feigned retreat, exactly like hunters luring prey into a trap. The Russian knights, led by the impetuous Prince Daniel, charged recklessly after them without coordinating with other forces. Even the experienced Mstislav of Kiev made the same mistake by ordering his troops forward. The Russians didn't realize they were playing the Mongols' game. After an exhausting chase of several kilometers, they suddenly found themselves in a wide plain surrounded by hills on 3 sides and the river on the 4th. Here the real disaster unfolded. The fleeing Mongol forces wheeled about with astonishing discipline, while fresh troops emerged from concealed positions in the surrounding hills. Within hours, the Kalka plain turned into hell. The exhausted, heavily armored Russian knights found themselves helpless against the relentless Mongol arrow storm. Cuman troops tried to flee but collided with additional Mongol units, tightening the noose around the battlefield. The final scene was most tragic of all. Prince Mstislav of Kiev found himself trapped with his personal guard on a small hill, watching his army being slaughtered below. He organized desperate defenses, but to no avail. By sunset, the river ran red with blood and the plain was littered with dead knights and their horses. The princes who had quarreled over command hours earlier were now either dead or captured. And the following days, the Mongols held a victory feast atop their enemies' bodies. They placed wooden platforms over the captive princes and sat upon them eating and drinking while their victims slowly suffocated beneath. This was the Mongol way of sending a clear message to the world. Such was the fate of those who challenged the Mongol Empire. When news of the catastrophe reached Russian cities, panic spread everywhere. From Kiev to Novgorod, people prepared for the apocalypse. Yet ironically, the Mongols vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, returning east without continuing their advance. They left behind a lesson the Russians would never forget: unite or perish. The Battle of Kalka River was more than a military defeat, it was a civilizational shock that exposed all the flaws of the Russian feudal system. It showed how fragmentation and arrogance could turn the mightiest armies into easy prey for clever, organized enemies. These lessons would eventually lead the Russians to adopt a strong centralized system, ironically drawing inspiration from some of the very Mongol tactics that had nearly destroyed them. The Battle of Kalka River, the fiery storm that transformed warfare on the fateful dawn of battle. As thick fog enveloped the Kalka plain, the Russian and Cuman forces remained unaware they were about to encounter a weapon never before seen in their wars. The Mongols, with their visionary military acumen spanning from China to Europe, had brought with them a deadly secret from the Far East: unquenchable fire, choking smoke, and deafening thunder. In the Mongol camp before daybreak, special army artisans prepared their secret weapons. With skilled hands, they filled ceramic vessels with a strange black powder, sealing them tightly with hemp fuses. Some containers bore combustible cloth strips, while others contained small metal fragments to increase lethality. This magical powder, known to the Chinese as huiyao, would write a new chapter in military history. As the first sunlight pierced the fog, Jebe gave his famous command. Suddenly, thunderous explosions echoed across the plain, followed by flashes of red and yellow fire. The Russian forces, accustomed to traditional sword and spear combat, stood bewildered. The prized Cuman horses, unaccustomed to such sounds, reared in panic, creating chaos in the ranks. Amid this confusion, Mongol arrows began raining down, each carrying burning cloth at its tail. Some arrows had been dipped in flammable substances, setting Russian tents and equipment ablaze. Thick black smoke mixed with pungent sulfur fumes made breathing difficult and visibility nearly impossible. At the decisive moment, while the Russians struggled to extinguish fires and salvage their position, terrifying Mongol war drums sounded. Through the dense smoke, Mongol cavalry emerged like ghosts, their gleaming swords cutting through the air. The Cuman forces, the alliance's eyes and ears, were first to break. Convinced the Mongols wielded demonic powers, they fled in terror, exposing the Russian flank. Prince Daniel of Galicia, who had boasted of his courage hours earlier, found himself surrounded by endless smoke and inexplicable explosions. His armored knights, veterans of countless battles, became easy targets in the artificial haze. Their prized heavy armor turned into instruments of torture, heating up like portable ovens. In this hellish chaos, Grand Prince Mstislav of Kiev attempted to rally his troops. But commands were lost in the cacophony of explosions and panicked horses. Some soldiers, believing the sky itself was falling, threw down their weapons to pray. Others, in their terror, attacked comrades mistaken for enemies in the smoke. By noon, the Kalka plain had become a vision of hell. Flames consumed equipment and tents, black smoke blotted out the sun, and corpses of knights and horses piled everywhere. The Mongols, masters of fighting in such conditions, tightened their merciless noose. In subsequent days, as news of these demonic weapons spread, terror gripped all Russian principalities. Priests declared them signs of the apocalypse, while military artisans struggled in vain to understand these strange technologies. The Mongols, true to form, revealed no secrets but left behind destruction, testifying to their new weapons' power. Though not the first battle to employ gunpowder weapons, Kalka marked Europe's first true encounter with these technologies on the battlefield. It became a technological shock that forever changed Eastern Europe's understanding of warfare, ushering in a new era, the age of gunpowder and firearms that would permanently transform the face of war. The Battle of Kalka River, the leadership tragedy that changed Russia's destiny. In the great Russian command tent pitched miles from the banks of the Kalka River, the most powerful princes of Rus had gathered. The air was thick with tension and jealousy as each ruler sat surrounded by personal guards and advisors, all clad in exquisite armor bearing jewel-encrusted swords. At the center upon a gilded elevated chair sat Mstislav III, Grand Prince of Kiev, surveying the others with arrogant superiority. Beside him stood Mstislav Mstislavich of Galicia, a formidable warrior distinguished by his powerful physique and thick mustache that twitched nervously during disputes. In the corner sat young Daniel of Volhynia, silent yet with eyes burning with youthful enthusiasm and desire to prove himself. Outside the tent, the scene was even more chaotic. Soldiers from different principalities clustered in separate groups, each flying their own banners and speaking distinct dialects. There was no coordination between these units. Each prince had brought his personal army without any joint strategy. Even the horses differed. Kiev's massive warhorses contrasted with Galicia's swift mounts and Chernigiv's sturdy breeds. Set apart from all stood the Cumans, their leader Khan Kotian, the shrewd steppe warrior, desperately trying through interpreters to convey warnings about the Mongol threat. When war council began, arguments erupted immediately. Mstislav of Kiev insisted on supreme command by virtue of seniority, while the Prince of Galicia countered that he had more experience fighting nomads. Young Daniel proposed a swift attack, while Kotian urged caution. The debate raged for hours without resolution, ending with each prince pursuing his own plan. At dawn, when Mongol scouts appeared, the Russian prince's reactions revealed all their leadership flaws. Young Daniel, in youthful enthusiasm, launched a reckless charge without orders. The Prince of Galicia, eager to prove his valor, led his knights in a headlong pursuit. Meanwhile, Mstislav of Kiev remained in the rear with his forces, dismissing the engagement as mere skirmishing. When the Mongols began their feigned retreat, the Russian response proved catastrophic. The Prince of Galicia, rather than suspecting deception, demanded reinforcements to continue pursuit. Mstislav of Kiev, in his hubris, believed the Mongols fled specifically from him. Young Daniel, in his military naivety, suddenly found himself surrounded on three sides. By evening, the Russian leadership failures became undeniable. Princes couldn't communicate through the chaos, each trying only to save his own forces. Mstislav of Kiev, the supposed commander, found himself isolated on a small hill, helplessly watching his army slaughtered. The Prince of Galicia, realizing his fatal error, found retreat routes blocked. Young Daniel suffered grave wounds attempting to break the encirclement. By nightfall, the disaster was complete. Mstislav of Kiev surrendered after 3 days trapped without provisions. The Prince of Galicia miraculously escaped but lost most of his army. Young Daniel was carried away wounded and traumatized. The Cumans had vanished from the battlefield entirely. In the following weeks, as survivors returned home, the story was the same everywhere: we lost because our leaders cared more for their quarrels than the enemy. This horrific defeat became a turning point in Russian history, teaching that unity alone ensured survival. 2 centuries later, when Ivan the Terrible founded a unified Russian state, he always invoked the bloody lesson of Kalka: division is death, unity is life. The prince's fatal disunity at Kalka became legendary, their names forever tied to one of Russia's greatest military catastrophes before the Mongol invasions proper began. Their failure birthed a national consciousness that would ultimately overthrow the Mongol yoke. The shock of Kalka, the wound that gave birth to Great Russia in the vast Eurasian steppes, where the Kalka River silently merges with the currents of history, there occurred a defeat that would forever shake the conscience of the Russian nation. This was no ordinary lost battle, but rather a painful labor that gave birth to a new Russia, a Russia that learned from the blood spilled on the sands of that small river, lessons which would forever alter its destiny. When the last survivors returned to Kiev bearing news of the catastrophe, a graveyard silence fell over Russian cities. Women stood at church doors awaiting any word of their loved ones, while priests pored over Bible pages searching for meaning in this calamity. In the palace of the Kievan prince, the silence was heaviest, where nobles sat as if struck dumb, their eyes staring vacantly, unable to comprehend how their organized armies could have been crushed so easily. Yet from the ashes of this bitter defeat, a new consciousness began to crystallize. For the first time in centuries, Russian princes realized their internal disputes weren't mere rivalries, but fatal cracks in the nation's armor. This realization slowly seeped into the Russian collective mind like a small seed unwittingly planted by the Mongols in the soil of history. In the years following the battle, as the Mongols prepared their great invasion, Russian cities existed in a state of terrified anticipation. Every nighttime shout, every dust cloud on the horizon sparked panic. Yet paradoxically, this shared fear began creating something unprecedented, a sense of fateful unity among the warring principalities. When the Mongols returned under Bata Khan 15 years later, the picture differed. Yes, Kiev fell, great cities were destroyed, yet something had shifted in the Russian psyche. New stories emerged of heroic resistance, villages choosing death over surrender, princes beginning to think differently. During the Golden Horde's 2.5-century rule, Kalka's lessons matured slowly. The Russians learned from their Mongol conquerors lessons they'd never have learned in victory: centralized administration, organized taxation, military intelligence, rapid communications. These would become building blocks for eventual rebellion. In the halls of the emerging Moscow Kremlin, Muscovite princes carefully studied Kalka's causes. Ivan Khalida, called gatherer of the Russian land, first deeply understood the lesson: there was no place for small principalities in a world of great powers. His grandson Ivan III, who finally liberated Russia from Mongol rule, carried that bitter lesson spirit in his decisions. Even in modern times, Kalka's echoes persist. When Peter the Great modernized Russia, when the nation resisted Napoleon's invasion, even during World War II challenges, the memory of that battle remained as both a warning against division and a reminder of national unity's power. Today, as the Kalka River flows peacefully as it has for centuries, the battle remains a turning point in Russian history. Not merely a military defeat, but a moment of awakening, an existential shock that roused the nation from slumber. From that battle's blood was born a unified Russia, one that learned its strength lies in unity, and that today's enemy may become tomorrow's teacher. Thus Kalka's catastrophe transformed into a foundational myth, a sacred wound in national memory, reminding successive generations that greatest victories may be born from the womb of bitter defeats. The Mongols came as conquerors but remained as unwitting midwives to Russia's rebirth, an irony that shaped the destiny of a nation rising from the ashes of its greatest humiliation to become an empire that would eventually surpass its teachers. This profound paradox makes Kalka not just a historical event, but the crucible in which modern Russia was forged. On the brink of catastrophe, the challenges facing the Russians before the Battle of Kalka River in the winter of 1222, as icy eastern winds howled across the Russian steppes, strange rumors began circulating in princely courts and peasant villages alike. Tales of a strange army coming from the ends of the earth, destroying everything in its path. But these warnings fell on deaf ears in a land riddled with deep divisions and existential challenges. In Kiev, the great capital of Russian principalities, Prince Mstislav III was more preoccupied with internal power struggles than external threats. His days were spent trying to assert his authority over rival princes while the state coffers emptied after years of civil wars. In Galicia, young Prince Daniel Romanovich dreamed of personal glory, oblivious to the rapidly changing world around him. In Novgorod, wealthy merchants remained engrossed in their riches, believing their fortified city walls could withstand any danger. Political fragmentation posed the greatest challenge. Russia in those days was not a unified state but a collection of rival principalities bound by language and religion yet divided by narrow self-interests. Each prince considered himself an independent ruler, each principality minted its own coins, raised its own army, and followed its own policies. Even in the face of imminent danger, these princes couldn't agree on unified leadership or common strategy. Military preparedness presented another equally dangerous challenge. The Russians relied on an outdated feudal system where each noble brought his own knights and servants to battle without joint training or real coordination. Their armored knights, once the pride of Russian armies, became a liability against the Mongols' mobile tactics. Their military equipment, though ornate, was traditional and obsolete compared to the Mongols' advanced weapons and innovative warfare techniques. In princely halls, personal disputes overshadowed strategic discussions. Mstislav of Kiev distrusted the intentions of Galician princes, who in turn despised the rulers of Vladimir, and all looked down upon their Cuman allies. These divisions ran so deep that some military units refused to follow orders from commanders of other principalities. Even on the battlefield, strategic miscalculation was the bleeding wound in Russian leadership. Despite numerous warnings from merchants and spies, despite terrifying stories of destroyed cities in Central Asia, the Russians continued underestimating the Mongol threat. Some princes believed the vast steppes would protect them, others thought their organized armies were invincible, and many simply couldn't conceive that barbarians from the east could threaten their ancient civilization. Logistically, disaster loomed. There were no organized supply lines, no troop movement plans, not even agreement on a common language for military commands among different principalities. Some armies arrived without adequate provisions, others got lost in the expansive steppes before even reaching the battlefield. Even the horses, fundamental to any army of that time, varied dramatically in quality and capability between principalities. The psychological challenges proved perhaps most dangerous. Years of internal wars and easy victories over weaker neighbors had given the Russians excessive confidence in their abilities. The ruling elite, isolated in their luxurious palaces, had lost touch with the changing world. Even as news of Mongol destruction reached them, they dismissed it as exaggerated legends or problems belonging to distant others. In the final weeks before battle, their Cuman allies, who had previously suffered Mongol devastation, tried warning them. Cuman leader Kotian sent repeated messages describing the Mongols' destructive power and deceptive tactics. But rather than listen, some princes accused him of cowardice, while others saw his warnings as political maneuvering. On the night before battle, as the Mongols perfected their plans with meticulous precision, the Russian camp buzzed with chaos. Each prince held his separate war council, each group spoke its own language, each unit followed its distinct signals. There was no unified plan, no clear command structure, not even agreement on who should attack first. These combined challenges, political fragmentation, military unpreparedness, internal disputes, strategic miscalculations, logistical problems, and overconfidence, created the perfect storm for defeat. When dawn broke, the Russians found themselves facing an army not only superior in numbers and weaponry, but 100 times more disciplined, organized, and cohesive than their discordant forces. In the end, Russia lost the Battle of Kalka not just because of Mongol strength, but because of its own internal weaknesses, its inability to address challenges that had been accumulating for years. The defeat was inevitable before the armies even met, for those who fail to learn from past challenges are forced to confront their consequences in the future. The fragmented principalities, each clinging to its own narrow interests while ignoring the gathering storm, marched blindly toward a catastrophe that would reshape their history forever. Blood on the Kalka's banks, the human tragedy that reshaped Russia in the aftermath of the bloody Battle of Kalka River. The Russian steppe bore witness not just to the stench of blood and gunpowder, but to the birth of an entirely new social and medical reality. The scene in the first days after the battle resembled a surrealist painting of hell: armored knights' corpses entangled with their dead horses, the moans of wounded men crawling toward water sources, the cries of women searching for husbands and sons among piles of the dead. In surrounding villages, small churches transformed into makeshift hospitals where priests attempted primitive treatment of the wounded. Medicines ran out quickly, and herbal remedies proved inadequate against this flood of injuries. The few available doctors, accustomed to treating agricultural ailments and colds, faced completely unfamiliar wounds, arrows piercing eyes, wounds bleeding for days, multiple fractures they didn't know how to set. Some tried using alcohol to disinfect injuries, others resorted to cauterization with fire to stop bleeding, often resulting in patients dying from shock or infection. In Kiev, the great city that witnessed not the battle but its consequences, palaces became shelters for the wounded. Princess Anastasia, wife of the slain prince, recounted how palace floors transformed into lakes of crimson blood as wounded men died successively from inadequate medicine. "We didn't know who to save first," she wrote in her memoirs, the man who lost his legs, the child with burned skin, or the old man driven mad by what he'd seen. Disease and plague proved no less deadly than Mongol swords. Within weeks, bubonic plague spread through surrounding villages. Historians believe the Mongols carried plague bacteria from Central Asia, with dead horses and unburied corpses creating fertile ground for infection. Entire villages disappeared from the map, not from direct killing but subsequent epidemics. In Novgorod, monks recorded the Black Death claiming a third of the city's population in just 2 months. The psychological scars ran far deeper than physical wounds. A whole generation of children grew up on horror stories about Tatars from the east. Monastery records describe strange cases of battle stupor where survivors sat motionless for days, staring vacantly, neither eating nor speaking. Others woke terrified from recurring nightmares of the battle. Priests called this demonic possession, though we now recognize it as early forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Russian social structure endured an unprecedented earthquake. In many villages, no adult men remained, forcing women into unfamiliar roles. Some became family heads, others worked fields and trades previously reserved for men. Many villages transformed into single-sex communities where elderly women, widows and orphans formed the social backbone. In major cities, a new class of noble widows emerged, women who lost husbands in battle, many forced to sell jewels and property to survive. Russia's primitive healthcare system evolved by necessity. In Kiev, the new prince established the first field hospital for the wounded, staffed by Greek, Russian, and German doctors. Records describe early surgical attempts to remove arrows and amputations to save patients from gangrene. Some succeeded, many ended in death, yet they marked the beginnings of systematic medicine in Russia. The Russian collective memory became another battleground. Survivor stories circulated in various forms, some becoming folk legends, others mournful laments sung at weddings and funerals. Early Russian literature contains repeated references to the Black Day when the earth turned beneath nights' feet. Even today, remote villages preserve strange rituals commemorating victims, like throwing bread pieces into rivers as offerings to the dead. Generations born after the battle carried invisible but profound scars. Marriage rates plummeted as youth feared starting families that might be slaughtered anytime. Birth rates declined for a decade, not just from missing men but fear of the future. Some historians believe this Mongol complex would haunt Russians for centuries, appearing in their arts, literature, even major political decisions. Yet from this tragedy emerged positive seeds. Russians learned unity wasn't a luxury but survival necessity. The medical system, however primitive, began taking more organized form. Women gained unprecedented rights and status. While insufficient to balance the catastrophe scale, these developments helped Russia rise again, stronger, more resilient, better prepared for coming challenges. The Kalka's bloody waters ultimately nourished the roots of a renewed nation.